You know, the thing I think I like the most about Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is not the combat or the multitude of characters, it's just the fact of the thrill of winning. And maybe that you can kick around your opponent's unconscious body after you win. This isn't a bit, I'm actually just fond of that poor sportsmanship. Hey friends, I'm Pragmatic and I like to talk about video games. And I've got my fair share of fighting games that I absolutely love. I'm pumped to hear about the Capcom fighting game collection, and I'm actually pretty excited about the Street Fighter 6 announcement. But I've got to think back to one of the OG games and talk about Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. To really appreciate a product like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, we have to go back and really think about the time frame we were in. Capcom and Marvel were, at the time, very happy to work with one another, with Capcom previously creating works like X-Men, Children of the Atom, and Marvel Superheroes, the fighting game. Eventually Capcom would tie in their own properties to make the first installment of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, starting with X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and soon after what would become Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. And later still, we would see the birth of the legendary Marvel vs. Capcom games, some of the best fighting games of all time, and one of the first beacons of the competitive fighting game scene. Having a successful partnership with a plentiful selection of great titles is one thing, but you have to also understand that the creative freedom was at an all-time high. Years later, we would see the Street Fighter vs. SNK collab series bring some contention on what Ryu the World Warrior could wear outside of his usual fighting gi. But in the infancy of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, we had the decision to make Akuma part robot as a final boss, and everyone was okay with that, and we all just kinda went with it. Now might be the part where I create a little contention of my own. Because while I do genuinely enjoy the works of Marvel vs. Capcom, and every following title after, maybe except for the last one, my favorite game of the entire series has to be Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. And I mean no disrespect to the Marvel vs. Capcom series. I understand that Marvel vs. Capcom is some of the most refined work out there, but you have to understand before we could get to the 3-on-3 mashups, Capcom had to really get a good feel of all these unique characters, and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is where I feel it all began. Now, I would be remiss to claim that Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter did all the work. A lot of the groundwork was already established with X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and even before that. But I feel at this point, everything was beginning to become really polished. What with Capcom already starting to add in more flavor with its traditional Shoto characters, but also refining other characters. For example, this version of Dalzeen might be one of my favorite versions of him. His supers are much more unique, and even his speed felt a little faster. The Marvel characters all felt super tight as well, and just as fun to use. And this is one of the rare examples that out of the entire roster, there isn't one character in the game that I don't want to use. Each and every character is something unique, and it was all of this choice of combat that really paved the way for the Marvel vs. Capcom series to take off. If I'm telling the truth, I could probably make this exact same stance on X-Men vs. Street Fighter, as it's pretty much on par with this game. But to me, this game comes through with a little bit more polish and a little more balanced gameplay. Infinite juggling was a big feature in X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and some people even prefer that style, but I feel the more casual gameplay from Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter has a bigger appeal to me. Call me a casual, I can take it. Changes were being made even before Marvel and Capcom started working together. Tweaks have been made since Alpha and even in the original series. But this is where I felt the hardware was starting to catch up to the developers' expectations. Street Fighter Alpha 2 and 3 are honestly at the top of my list when it comes to fighting games. But with Alpha 2 running on the SNES, a little bit of lag was starting to become apparent. The movement to Sega Saturn and PlayStation saw the games having a better flow to them, with moves that could be used and combined to form screen-filling attacks blended in all sorts of unique ways. Just another thing that gave Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter another feature that makes it all its own. Despite the upgrade to hardware, the PS1 in particular still had its limitations. The 2-on-2 tag team of the arcade version and even the Sega Saturn still wasn't possible, but the crossover mode did its best to give players that 2-on-2 sensation, even if it just meant palette swaps of who you chose. That and the hero mode helped make up for it as well, as it would put you on one side or the other, in a winner-takes-all tournament. Also, major props to the announcer. Capcom used to pick out great voice actors back in the day to be the hyped-up announcer for each fight that would take place. But one of my favorite things was this particular announcer would do their best to call out the special finishers when they were successfully performed. Even the more difficult to announce Street Fighter finishers. It's this nice touch of polish and flavor that makes Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter really stand out. You've got this hyped up announcer, lots of characters with creative liberties taken to the most standard of moves, and honestly the character portraits done up in this unique art style just looks so good. I don't know, Wolverine looks like he kinda has this feral house cat struggling to be domesticated look, but I love it. Honestly, this is one of my favorite games to actually fight someone else in. Seriously, if you know how to play and you're up against someone else that knows how to play, then Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter can create some of the tensest fights of your life. With how tight the gameplay is, you can actually feel yourself tense up when you're not sure if your finisher is going to land or not. It's just so good.
Dreams don't die!
I'm pretty sure he says dreams don't die, but I always used to think he said please don't die. Like he thinks he overdid it and hopes he didn't just kill someone. And even though I know I can go without mentioning it because it's a Capcom fighting game, I'm still going to mention it. The music is great, possibly some of the best of its time. I love Alpha 3, but I hope you love this sound font. Because nearly every character's theme in that game is composed with that sound font in mind. In this game there is repetition of sound fonts, but at least each character gets a theme that feels like it was made for them. I feel like Wolverine has this kind of tragic theme to them, while Sakura's feels more youthful and full of spirit. Theming the music to each character is something that just feels so essential to me, and Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter is one that does it well. Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter brought in characters from all over the Street Fighter timeline, letting us use newer and older characters, and Marvel did the same, bringing in lesser known villains such as Shuma Gorath and Blackheart, but ones that definitely shine through in terms of gameplay. Shuma actually being a more favorite character of mine through the Marvel side of the roster. You weren't just using the same names you always see.
And you know, with every video game, there's always like one or two really bad things. But in this case, there's just one really bad thing.
It's Cyber Akuma. It's definitely Cyber Akuma. My god, do I hate Cyber Akuma. He's a double damage dealing, screen covering, input reading, move countering jerk. Like seriously, I like a good challenge, but man is he just too much. To me, he puts legendary fights like Seth and Gil to shame. He is just super overbearing, and I usually feel that you either beat him by getting a lucky start or by spamming just enough to utilize a good combination finisher. One plus here is that the game doesn't adjust its AI. You get what you choose, so you're in it for the long run if you're struggling to beat him. While I appreciate not being handed a win, I feel that the Sega Saturn had a better setup for dealing with Cyber Akuma. The Saturn had a tag team system much more like the later installments of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, but the PS1 version, aka the one I'm more familiar with, only allowed you to call upon your teammates to perform finishers and a special move here and there, so fighting Akuma with just one health bar instead of two really made a difference. This game was an example of Capcom knowing that they were really hitting good marks with the direction they wanted to go with this series. Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter was just the peak point of the game's development. Really, there isn't an artistic aspect of this game that falls behind in the slightest. From fighting high up in treetops to a more public area where spectators think that Ryu going up against Spider-Man would be a dream fight, it's honestly a nice touch that Capcom had implemented into their game since the very beginning of the Street Fighter series. Not unique to this game of course, but something that makes the fight feel more alive. Adding onto that, the thought put into these special moves are just fantastic. From Wolverine's Weapon X to Dhalsim's fluid finishers, there's just no limit to how you can utilize your moves. Though it should be said, it feels like some characters may have been given more consideration to just how many moves they get than others. Looking at you, Wolverine. And this of course doesn't only extend to finishers. Special moves in general look fluid as well as impactful. Cyclops' running tackle is a really good example of this, but pretty much anything Cyclops has at his disposal makes him a major threat not to be trifled with. I'm especially staring daggers at those of you that only took the time to learn how to spam Optic Blast. I also love this idea that Sakura is portrayed as having a lot of power in her attacks, but also that she's still too green to utilize it, like how she has to charge her move a bit before she can actually really get a good result out of it. And of course, Dan is just Dan. Love him though. I'll proudly stand by my belief that Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter may just be the best of the lot. I've gone back to Marvel vs. Capcom and I do enjoy the games, but as they progressed I felt they turned more and more into these juggle fests, resulting in you just keeping your opponent in the air as long as you can. And maybe I'm the minority here when it comes to wanting a close fight as opposed to an all-out juggle fest. If that's a badge that paints me as a casual, then it's a badge I'll wear with pride. Also, after defeating Cyber Akuma, you can just start fighting against your teammate, and that's just about the dumbest feature ever, and I love it.
I did it!
Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching me gush about a fighting game I absolutely love. If there's someone that shares my passion for the earlier Marvel vs. Capcom titles, please tell me down in the comments so I don't feel so alone. Leave a like if you liked the video and consider subscribing if you're new. Thanks for watching and keep it practical.